Karl adjusted the straps of his backpack, feeling the cold bite of the Bavarian alpine air, even through his thick jacket. Beside him, Hans, his seasoned guide, trudged forward with determined steps, leading the way up the narrow, snow-covered path. The storm had started unexpectedly early that morning, turning their straightforward journey into a battle against nature. The wind howled, carrying flurries of snow that stung their faces and obscured their vision. Karl squinted, trying to make out the shape of the chalet that Hans had assured him was just ahead. "There it is," Hans finally called out, pointing to a faint silhouette in the distance. Karl sighed in relief, quickening his pace. The chalet, though rustic and worn, stood as a beacon of warmth and safety in the midst of the relentless blizzard. As they reached the front door, Hans fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking from the cold. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior that felt surprisingly welcoming. Karl stepped inside, the warmth immediately enveloping him. He took in the cozy yet eerie atmosphere. The wooden beams, the flickering fireplace, and the old, worn furniture that seemed to whisper tales of the past. "We'll be safe here until the storm passes," Hans said, his voice filled with both reassurance and an underlying tension. He began unpacking their gear while Karl explored the main room, his eyes catching on various objects that hinted at the chalet's long history. Karl approached an old photograph hanging on the wall. It depicted a stern-looking man standing in front of the very chalet they were now in. His eyes seemed to follow Karl, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Who's this?" Karl asked, pointing to the photograph. Hans glanced over, a shadow crossing his face. "That's Herr Schwartz. He owned this chalet many years ago. They say he went mad during a storm much like this one and disappeared." Karl raised an eyebrow. "Disappeared?" Hans shrugged, focusing on lighting the fireplace. "That's the story. Some say his spirit still haunts this place, looking for trespassers." Karl laughed, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Hans didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. The wind outside howled louder, as if mocking Karl's skepticism. As the evening wore on, they settled in, the storm raging outside. Karl couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him since they'd arrived. He tried to rationalize it as fatigue from their arduous trek, but the sensation lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Just as they were about to turn in for the night, a sudden sharp noise echoed through the chalet. Karl froze, his eyes meeting Hans's wide-eyed gaze. "What was that?" Karl whispered, his heart pounding. Hans shook his head, his face pale. "It's probably just the wind." But Karl knew it wasn't the wind. The sound had been too deliberate, too precise. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously through the dimly lit rooms, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. As they reached the back of the chalet, Karl noticed a cold draft coming from a slightly ajar window. He walked over and closed it, peering into the darkness outside. "See, just the wind," Hans said, though his voice lacked conviction. Karl nodded, though his unease remained. As they headed back to the main room, he glanced at the photograph of Herr Schwartz again, feeling the man's eyes on him. He shook off the sensation, telling himself it was just his imagination. As they settled into their beds, Karl couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The chalet, with its history and the storm raging outside, seemed to have a life of its own, watching, waiting. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to relax. Tomorrow, he told himself, they would explore the surroundings and perhaps uncover more about this enigmatic place. For now, he needed rest. But sleep did not come easily, and as Karl drifted off, he couldn't help but wonder what secrets the chalet held and what the night might bring. Karl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. Despite the warmth of the chalet, a chill had settled into his bones. He turned to see Hans already asleep, his snores barely audible over the storm. Trying to shake off his unease, Karl closed his eyes and forced himself to relax. He had just begun to drift into sleep when a sharp noise jerked him awake. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound came again, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the old wooden floors. "Hans," Karl whispered, reaching over to shake his friend. Hans groaned and opened his eyes, blinking in confusion. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Do you hear that?" Carl asked, his voice low. Hans listened, his eyes widening as the footsteps grew louder. He sat up, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. "Stay here," he said, his voice tense. Carl nodded, but felt a surge of determination. "I'm coming with you." They moved cautiously through the chalet, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. They checked each room, finding nothing out of place. Just as they were about to give up, they heard a loud crash from the kitchen. They rushed to the kitchen, finding the window they had closed earlier now wide open. Snow blew in, coating the floor in a thin layer of frost. Hans closed the window again, locking it securely. "It's just the wind," Hans said, though his voice lacked confidence. Carl wasn't convinced. The window was locked. Something's not right. Hans didn't argue. They checked the kitchen thoroughly, but found no signs of an intruder. As they returned to the main room, Carl felt a cold draft and saw the photograph of Herr Schwartz swaying slightly, as if someone had touched it. "I think there's something here," Carl said quietly, pointing to the photograph. Hans's face paled. "You're starting to believe the stories?" Carl shrugged, his mind racing. "I don't know what to believe, but something's definitely happening." They decided to stay in the main room for the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch. Hans dozed off first, leaving Carl alone with his thoughts. The minutes dragged on, each creak and groan of the old chalet setting his nerves on edge. Just as Carl was beginning to relax, a whisper reached his ears. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakably a voice. He strained to listen, his heart racing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but he couldn't make out the words. "Hans, wake up," Carl said urgently, shaking his friend awake. Hans woke with a start, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it now?" "Listen," Carl said, his voice trembling. They both listened, the whisper growing louder. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a disembodied voice speaking in a language neither of them understood. "We need to get out of here," Hans said, his voice shaking. Carl nodded, but the blizzard outside made it impossible. "We can't. We'll freeze to death." Hans looked around, his fear palpable. "Then what do we do?" Carl thought for a moment, trying to remain calm. "We wait until morning. Whatever this is, it seems stronger at night." They huddled together, the whispering continuing until dawn. As the first light of day filtered through the windows, the whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Hans let out a sigh of relief. "Maybe it's gone." Carl shook his head. "We can't be sure. We need to find out more about this place." They spent the morning exploring the chalet, searching for any clues about the haunting. In a small, dusty room at the back of the chalet, Carl found an old leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting barely legible. "Hans, look at this," Carl said, holding up the diary. Hans took the diary, flipping through the pages. "This could tell us what's happening here." They sat down to read the diary, hoping it would provide answers to the mysterious occurrences. As they began to decipher the faded writing, they realized that the secrets of the chalet were far darker than they had imagined. Carl and Hans huddled over the diary, the fireplace's flickering light casting shadows on the worn pages. The writing was difficult to decipher, but they persisted, driven by the hope of uncovering the chalet's secrets. "This diary belongs to Herr Schwartz," Hans said, squinting at the faded ink. "He wrote about the winter of 1902, the last recorded year before his disappearance." Carl nodded, leaning in to read more. "He mentions being trapped here by a storm, much like us. But look, here he writes about hearing voices and seeing apparitions." Hans's eyes widened. So it wasn't just a legend. He experienced the same things we are. They continued reading, piecing together Herr Schwartz's descent into madness. His entries became increasingly erratic, filled with desperate pleas for help and paranoid ramblings about unseen forces. "I can feel it closing in," one entry read. "The malevolent presence grows stronger each night. It whispers my name, taunts me with my deepest fears. I fear I will not survive this storm." As they read on, they found a detailed description of a ritual, that Herr Schwartz believed could banish the spirit haunting him. It required specific items and a personal sacrifice, something of great sentimental value. "This must be the key," Karl said, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. "If we can perform this ritual, maybe we can put an end to this." Hans nodded, though his face was pale. "But we need to find these items. And what about the personal sacrifice?" Karl glanced at his backpack, where he kept a small old locket, his last connection to his late mother. He took a deep breath, knowing what he had to do. "I have something," he said quietly. "It's a locket that belonged to my mother. It means a lot to me." Hans placed a reassuring hand on Karl's shoulder. "We'll do this together. Let's gather the items and prepare." They spent the rest of the morning searching the chalet for the items listed in the diary. A candle made from beeswax, a piece of iron, and a vial of salt water. Surprisingly, they found everything they needed in an old chest in the attic, as if Herr Schwartz had left them behind for someone to find. "This is too convenient," Hans muttered, almost as if he knew someone would come after him. Karl didn't respond, focusing on their task. They brought the items down to the main room and set them up as described in the diary. As they worked, Karl couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. With everything in place, they waited for nightfall, the tension between them growing. Hans paced the room, glancing nervously at the windows as the storm continued to rage outside. Karl sat by the fireplace, clutching the locket, his mind racing with memories of his mother. As dusk settled in, the temperature dropped, and the eerie silence of the chalet seemed to deepen. Karl and Hans lit the candle and positioned the items according to the diary's instructions. They recited the incantation, their voices trembling with both fear and determination. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew cold, and the whispering began again, louder and more insistent than before. The candle flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Karl took a deep breath and placed the locket in the center of the circle they had drawn on the floor. As he did, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candle and plunging them into darkness. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Karl and Hans held their breath, waiting. Slowly, the candle relit itself, its flame now steady and bright. "It worked," Hans whispered, relief evident in his voice. Karl nodded, though he felt a deep sense of loss. The locket was gone, consumed by the ritual, but the oppressive presence had lifted. The chalet felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its very walls. As they cleaned up, Karl glanced at the photograph of Herr Schwartz. For the first time, the man's eyes seemed at peace. "We did it," Karl said quietly. "We freed him." Hans smiled, clapping Karl on the back. "Let's get some rest. We'll need our strength for the journey back once the storm clears." They settled in for the night, exhaustion taking over. For the first time since their arrival, the chalet was silent, offering them a peaceful night's sleep. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows, casting a serene glow across the chalet. For the first time since their arrival, Karl and Hans woke feeling rested. The previous night's ritual seemed to have worked, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. As they prepared breakfast, they discussed their plans for the day. The storm outside had not yet abated, making any immediate departure impossible. Karl suggested they spend the day preparing for their journey back and exploring the chalet further. Midway through their meal, a sudden violent gust of wind rattled the windows. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the once peaceful silence was shattered by a loud crash from the kitchen. Hans dropped his fork, his face pale. "What was that?" Karl stood, his muscles tensing. "Stay here. I'll check it out." He moved cautiously towards the kitchen, every step echoing in the now eerily silent chalet. As he entered the kitchen, he saw that the window they had secured the previous night was once again wide open. Snow blew in, covering the floor in a thin layer of frost. An iron skillet lay on the floor, spinning slowly as if it had just been thrown. Karl shut the window and locked it again, his heart pounding. He turned to leave, but a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and a whispering voice filled the room, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. "Hans!" Karl shouted, backing out of the kitchen. Hans rushed in, his eyes wide with fear. What happened? Carl pointed to the window. Something's still here. The ritual didn't work. They retreated to the main room, the temperature dropping further. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the chalet. Objects began to move on their own. Chairs scraped across the floor. Books flew off shelves, and the candle they had used in the ritual relit itself with an eerie blue flame. Hans grabbed Carl's arm. We need to leave. Now. Carl nodded, but as they moved towards the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows followed suit, sealing them in. The whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and intertwining, creating a disorienting symphony of terror. Back to the main room, Carl shouted, pulling Hans with him. They stumbled back, the poltergeist's activity intensifying. Shadows danced on the walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out towards them. Carl grabbed the diary, frantically flipping through the pages for any additional clues. There has to be something we missed, he muttered, his hands shaking. Hans pointed to a passage near the end. Here. He wrote something about a second part of the ritual, a final step to completely banish the spirit. Carl read the passage aloud, his voice trembling. The final step requires a deeper sacrifice, an offering of blood to seal the spirit's fate. Hans's eyes widened. Blood? Whose blood? Carl took a deep breath, steeling himself. It has to be mine. I have to finish what we started. Hans protested, but Carl was resolute. We don't have a choice. It's the only way to end this. They quickly gathered the remaining items, setting up the ritual space once more. Carl took out his hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. He made a shallow cut on his palm, letting the blood drip into the circle they had drawn. As the blood touched the floor, the whispering intensified, then abruptly stopped. A deafening silence fell over the chalet, broken only by the sound of Carl's labored breathing. The temperature began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted once more. The candle flame flickered and died, leaving them in darkness. Slowly, the morning light seeped back into the room, and the weight that had pressed down on them vanished. Hans helped Carl bandage his hand, his expression a mix of relief and concern. Are you okay? Carl nodded, though he felt drained. I think it's over. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the stillness. The chalet, once a place of terror, now felt calm and peaceful. The storm outside began to subside, and a sense of normalcy returned. We should rest, Hans said. We'll need our strength for the journey back. Carl agreed, exhaustion overcoming him. As they settled in for another night, the chalet remained silent, offering them the peace they had longed for. But as Carl drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, watching and waiting. The following morning, Carl awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The storm had finally begun to ease, and the oppressive atmosphere in the chalet seemed to have lifted. Hans was already up, preparing a modest breakfast with what little supplies they had left. We need to gather our strength, Hans said, handing Carl a steaming cup of coffee. Today we finish this. Carl nodded, taking a sip of the hot beverage. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind, but he pushed his fears aside. They had come too far to turn back now. They needed to complete the final step of the ritual and ensure the poltergeist was banished for good. After breakfast, they set about gathering the remaining items needed for the ritual. The diary had mentioned a specific time when the ritual would be most effective: midnight, when the spirit's power was at its peak. They had only a few hours to prepare. Carl and Hans rummaged through the chalet, collecting the items they would need: a beeswax candle, a piece of iron, and a vial of salt water. Each item had a specific purpose in the ritual, and they carefully placed them in the main room. Do you really think this will work? Hans asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Carl met his gaze, determination in his eyes. We have to believe it will. We've seen what this spirit can do. We can't leave until it's gone. Hans nodded, though his expression remained troubled. And the blood sacrifice? Are you sure you're up for it? Carl glanced at the bandage on his hand, the memory of the previous night's events still fresh. It's the only way. I'll do what needs to be done. They spent the rest of the day double-checking their preparations, and ensuring everything was in place. The tension between them was palpable, but they worked silently, each lost in their own thoughts. As the sun began to set, the storm outside finally subsided, leaving a serene, snow-covered landscape in its wake. As midnight approached, they lit the beeswax candle and positioned the items according to the instructions in the diary. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Carl took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He made another shallow cut on his palm, letting the blood drip into the circle they had drawn on the floor. As the first drop hit the ground, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a familiar whispering filled the air. Hans watched in tense silence as Carl continued the ritual, reciting the incantation from the diary. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the candle flame flickered violently. "Stay strong," Hans whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. Carl nodded, his focus unwavering. He placed the piece of iron and the vial of salt water in the circle, completing the final steps of the ritual. As he did, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. Carl and Hans held their breath, waiting. Slowly, the candle relit itself, its flame burning brighter than before. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature began to rise. "Is it over?" Hans asked, his voice trembling. Carl nodded, though he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. "I think so. The spirit should be banished now." They sat in silence, absorbing the stillness. The chalet, once a place of terror, now felt calm and peaceful. The storm outside had cleared, and the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Hans helped Carl bandage his hand, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You did it. We did it." Carl managed a weak smile. "Let's get some rest. We'll need our strength for the journey back." They settled in for the night, exhaustion taking over. As they drifted off to sleep, the chalet remained silent, offering them the peace they had longed for. But in the back of Carl's mind, a nagging doubt lingered. Had they truly banished the spirit, or was it merely lying in wait? Carl and Hans awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving a serene, snow-covered landscape in its wake. For the first time since their arrival, the chalet felt peaceful. "We should prepare to leave," Hans said, breaking the morning silence. "We can't stay here any longer." Carl nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered from the previous night. They packed their belongings in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Just as they were about to step outside, a sudden sharp noise echoed through the chalet. They froze, exchanging worried glances. "What was that?" Hans whispered, his voice trembling. Carl tightened his grip on his backpack. "Let's check it out. We can't leave without knowing for sure." They cautiously made their way to the main room, where the noise had originated. The temperature had dropped again, and the oppressive atmosphere had returned. Carl's heart sank as he realized the ritual had not worked. The poltergeist was still there. Suddenly, the whispering began again, louder and more menacing than ever. Objects flew off shelves, and the candle they had used in the ritual relit itself with a ghostly blue flame. Shadows danced on the walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out towards them. "It's stronger than before," Hans shouted over the cacophony. "We need to finish this now." Carl nodded, determination replacing his fear. "Let's complete the ritual." They quickly set up the ritual space again, placing the beeswax candle, the piece of iron, and the vial of salt water in the circle. Carl made another cut on his palm, letting his blood drip onto the floor. As they began the incantation, the poltergeist's activity intensified. The whispering grew deafening, and the shadows on the walls writhed and twisted. The air became frigid, and a powerful gust of wind threatened to extinguish the candle. Hans struggled to keep his voice steady as he recited the incantation, while Carl focused on the task at hand. He poured the salt water into the circle, followed by the iron and finally the candle. The poltergeist let out a terrifying scream, the sound echoing through the chalet and shaking the very walls. The shadows converged on Carl, reaching out with ghostly hands. Hans stepped in front of him, shielding Carl with his own body. "No," Carl shouted, pushing Hans aside. We finished this together. They continued the ritual, their voices rising above the din. The poltergeist's screams grew louder, more desperate. The temperature plummeted, and a blinding light filled the room. Suddenly, the candle flame flickered and went out. The whispering ceased, and the room was plunged into silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. Carl and Hans stood in the darkness, their breathing heavy. Did we do it? Hans asked, his voice barely a whisper. Carl nodded, though he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I think so. The spirit should be gone now. They sat in silence, absorbing the stillness. The chalet, once a place of terror, now felt calm and peaceful. The storm outside had cleared, and the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Hans helped Carl bandage his hand, his expression a mix of relief and concern. You did it. We did it. Carl managed a weak smile. Let's get some rest. We'll need our strength for the journey back. They settled in for the night, exhaustion taking over. As they drifted off to sleep, the chalet remained silent, offering them the peace they had longed for. But in the back of Carl's mind, a nagging doubt lingered. Had they truly banished the spirit, or was it merely lying in wait? The next morning, they awoke to a bright, clear day. The snow glistened under the sunlight, and the oppressive atmosphere was completely gone. They packed their belongings and prepared to leave, feeling a sense of relief wash over them. As they stepped outside, Carl glanced back at the chalet. For the first time, it looked like a simple, peaceful retreat rather than a place of terror. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air fill his lungs. We did it, Hans said, clapping Carl on the back. We really did it. Carl nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Yes, we did. Let's go home. They began their journey back down the mountain, leaving the haunted chalet behind. But as they walked, Carl couldn't help but feel a sense of unfinished business. The spirit may have been banished, but the memory of their ordeal would stay with them forever. Carl and Hans descended the mountain in silence. The only sounds the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The clear, bright day was a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness they had faced in the chalet. The storm had left a pristine, untouched landscape, a serene beauty that belied the horrors they had endured. As they made their way back to the village, Carl couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. The ritual had seemed to work, and the poltergeist's presence had dissipated, but the memory of its terrifying power was still fresh. Hans walked beside him, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. When they reached the village, the locals greeted them with curious looks. Carl and Hans were a sight to behold, weary and battered from their ordeal. They made their way to the inn, where they were met by the innkeeper, a kindly woman with a warm smile. "Welcome back," she said, her eyes filled with concern. "You look like you've been through quite an ordeal." "We have," Hans replied, his voice hoarse. "But it's over now. The spirit has been banished." The innkeeper's eyes widened in surprise. "A spirit, you say? What happened up there?" Carl and Hans exchanged a glance before Carl spoke up. "It's a long story, but suffice it to say, the chalet is safe now." The innkeeper nodded, her expression softening. "Well, you're safe now. Come in, rest, and have a warm meal. You both look like you could use it." They followed her inside, grateful for the warmth and comfort of the inn. As they sat by the fire, enjoying a hearty meal, they recounted their experience in the chalet. The innkeeper listened with wide eyes, her hands occasionally flying to her mouth in shock. "You were brave to face such a thing," she said when they finished. "I'm glad you made it out safely." Carl nodded, though he felt a pang of guilt. "It wasn't just bravery. We were also very lucky, and I couldn't have done it without Hans." Hans smiled, clapping Carl on the back. "We did it together, and now we can finally rest." They spent the next few days in the village, recovering from their ordeal. The villagers were kind and hospitable, offering them food, shelter, and companionship. Carl and Hans began to feel like themselves again, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the inn, Carl pulled out the diary they had found in the chalet. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing the faded writing. "There's something I need to show you," he said, handing the diary to Hans. "I found another entry at the back, one we didn't see before." Hans took the diary, his eyes scanning the page. "What does it say?" Karl pointed to a passage near the end. "It's a note from Herr Schwartz. He mentions another hidden chamber in the chalet, one that holds even more secrets about the spirits in the Alps." Hans's eyes widened. "You think there could be more?" Karl nodded. "It's possible. And if there are more spirits out there, we need to be prepared." Hans sighed, closing the diary. "I thought we were done with this." "So did I," Karl admitted. "But if there's more to uncover, we can't ignore it. We've already seen what can happen if these spirits are left unchecked." Hans nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. "Then we'll face it together, like we did before." Karl smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Agreed. But first we rest. We'll need all our strength for whatever comes next." They spent the remainder of their stay in the village, preparing for their next journey, gathering supplies and information. The villagers, hearing of their plans, offered their support and assistance. As Karl and Hans prepared to leave, they felt a sense of camaraderie and determination. On the morning of their departure, the innkeeper handed Karl a small package. "For luck," she said with a smile, "and to remind you that you always have a place here." Karl opened the package to find a beautifully carved wooden amulet, a symbol of protection. He thanked the innkeeper, feeling a sense of gratitude and warmth. As they set off on their next journey, Karl and Hans felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had overcome the poltergeist of the Bavarian Alps, and though the memory of their ordeal would stay with them, they knew they had the strength and courage to face whatever came next. The sun was shining brightly as Karl and Hans left the village, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. The snow crunched underfoot as they made their way back up the mountain trail, their packs laden with supplies and the villagers' well wishes echoing in their minds. For the first time in days, Karl felt a sense of peace. The villagers had been kind, and their hospitality had given him and Hans the chance to recover both physically and mentally from their ordeal. But as they approached the chalet once more, a familiar sense of unease crept back into his thoughts. The chalet stood as they had left it, its exterior untouched by the poltergeist's wrath. It seemed almost inviting in the morning light, a stark contrast to the sinister place it had been during the storm. "We need to find that hidden chamber," Karl said, breaking the silence. Hans nodded, his expression resolute. "Let's get to work." They started their search in the main room, methodically checking the walls, floor, and any furniture that might conceal a secret entrance. Hours passed with no success, their frustration mounting. Just as they were about to take a break, Hans's hand brushed against a loose floorboard near the fireplace. "Here," Hans called out, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think I've found something." Karl hurried over, helping Hans lift the floorboard to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. They exchanged a tense glance before descending, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder as they descended, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and strange artifacts, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate chest. "This must be it," Karl said, approaching the chest with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He carefully lifted the lid, revealing an array of ancient documents and peculiar items. Hans picked up one of the documents, his eyes widening as he read. "These are records of other hauntings in the Alps. It seems Herr Schwartz was trying to document and understand the spirits." Karl examined the contents of the chest, finding a detailed map of the region with various locations marked. "Look at this. These must be places where other spirits are active." Hans looked over the map, his expression serious. "If this information is accurate, there could be many more hauntings just like the one we faced." Karl nodded, his mind racing with the implications. "We need to take this back with us. The villagers need to know, and we have to be prepared for whatever comes next." They carefully packed the documents and artifacts into their bags, making sure to leave the chamber as they had found it. As they ascended the staircase and replaced the floorboard, Karl felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their journey was far from over. As they left the chalet for the final time, Carl glanced back, feeling a strange sense of closure. The spirit of Herr Schwartz had been laid to rest, but their discovery hinted at a much larger mystery that awaited them. Their descent back to the village was uneventful, a peaceful landscape belying the gravity of their discovery. When they reached the village, they were greeted by the innkeeper and a few curious villagers. "What did you find?" the innkeeper asked, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. Carl and Hans shared a glance before Carl spoke. "We found records of other hauntings in the Alps. It seems there are many more spirits out there, and we need to be prepared." The villagers listened intently as Carl and Hans explained what they had discovered. The innkeeper nodded, her expression serious. "You have our support. Whatever you need, we'll help you." Carl smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie and determination. "Thank you. We'll need all the help we can get." As they settled in for the night, Carl and Hans discussed their next steps. They would need to investigate the marked locations on the map and gather more information about the spirits. It was a daunting task, but they were ready to face it together. Before they went to sleep, Carl took out the amulet the innkeeper had given him. He held it in his hand, feeling a sense of comfort and protection. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it with courage and resolve. The story of the poltergeist of the Bavarian Alps had come to an end, but their journey was just beginning. As they drifted off to sleep, they knew that the mysteries of the Alps awaited them, and they were ready to uncover the secrets that lay hidden in the snow-covered peaks. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.